Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Walrus Talks at Home Inclusion Part 2. This is a special two-part event presented by TD Bank Group. My name is Jennifer Hollett, and I am the Executive Director of the Walrus, and I'm really excited to welcome you all and to bring people together across the country in conversation. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on in Toronto, Tekaronto. I come to you from the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Toronto has long been a meeting place of Indigenous people, and we're honored to carry on a tradition of conversation. So please join me right now. Take a moment to reflect on the land that you're on, the moment in history that we're in, and the work of reconciliation. Thank you. The Walrus started 17 years ago as an optimistic project to tell stories and foster conversation across the country. And we do this in a bunch of different ways through our journalism in the print publication, but also online daily at thewalrus.ca, through our podcast, The Conversation piece, and our public event series, The Walrus Talks, which is now The Walrus Talks at Home. And this work is powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. So thank you all for being here and being a part of it. And a special thanks to TD Bank Group for making this event possible tonight. To start off the conversation, please welcome from TD Bank Group, Associate Vice President of Social Impact Canada, Naki Osute.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here on behalf of TD at tonight's The Walrus Talks on Inclusion. Since 2008, TD has been supporting the Walrus's efforts to provoke new thinking and spark conversation on matters that are vital to Canadians. So it's great to see the Walrus continue to do this, bringing these conversations online to the benefit of building a more informed society, even as we're facing a pandemic. Like the Walrus, TD is committed to fostering inclusive and accessible communities. So it's only natural that we partner to mark National Disability Employment Awareness Month with tonight's event. Through the TD Ready commitment, we strive to be a catalyst for resourcing these kinds of opportunities that promote and invest in the future of disability arts and communities. That's why we've also supported organizations like the Abilities Arts Festival, the Canadian Abilities Foundation, the Canadian Hearing Society Impact ASL program, and Prospect Human Services Society. Tonight, we will hear about how to create access and opportunities through community, design, and the arts. Artistry and community engagement can be powerful tools for promoting inclusion and enriching our society. They can be ways for people to communicate emotions and feelings that may otherwise be difficult to express, and they can serve as a vibrant medium to spark conversation and share perspectives. So I'm excited to hear from our panel of experts who will enrich our understanding of accessibility strategies that promote artistic excellence for people with disabilities. It's moments like these that I feel especially proud to be representing TD and to be representing our commitment toward building a more inclusive and accessible tomorrow for all. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Thanks so much, Naki. The conversation around inclusion, specifically with regards to people living with disabilities, is increasingly important in Canada and abroad. And this evening, for part 2 of our event, we're going to be hearing from industry leaders about how the arts, design, and community building can foster opportunities and promote accessibility. This is how it works. Each speaker tonight has 5 minutes. And then once we hear from the speakers and our head is full of new ideas, we'll have a moderated Q&A session where you'll all have a chance to ask a question. We're going to be hearing from Principal Accessibility Strategist at Level Playing Field, Darby Lee Young, Community Organizer, Jama, Musical Artist, Gift Tshuma, and writer, Dorothy Ellen Palmer. Thank you all for joining us.
Hi, my name is Darby, and I'm located here in Calgary. This is a fantastic time to have a conversation in regards to inclusion, but also, involving persons with disabilities when it comes to the built environment, but also festivals, which a lot of the time also gets forgotten. When I look at things as being an accessibility strategist for the last couple of years, a lot of the times we forget how to involve persons with disabilities or how spaces can become dangerous at times. A lot of the times we think, when we see accessibility, we think built environment, but we don't necessarily think about our day-to-day festivals and the day-to-day events that people can attend, prior to COVID, post-COVID, those sort of scenarios. And it's interesting because when we look at things, there's a scenario that I had about 5 years ago when I worked for a festival group. We were brought in to review drawings and the festival setup, but then we were also attending it to make sure that the accessibility was there to meet the needs of persons with disabilities. And for us, the biggest challenge was on the fact that when the lights went down, the entire festival was dark. Then it became a safety factor because we had persons with disabilities in a disability, like in a section where we were on a platform, but yet the pathway that led from that platform led us into the general public. And with no lights, it then became almost a trample situation because persons with disabilities, depending on if you're in a scooter or in a wheelchair, you're a lot lower than the able-bodied individuals walking. So you can't necessarily be seen. So what happens is we can literally be almost trampled, which becomes a safety factor. So when we look at inclusion, we want to make sure that I love my music festivals, and I'm extremely sad right now that we're in COVID and we're not able to enjoy those festivals, but that we also want to make sure we can go and have a good time and make it safe. Just like we think of the built environment, and we want to make sure that the built environment is accessible with ramps and washrooms and everything, we still need to consider those elements when we look at festivals, even the outdoor street festivals, and making sure that we put ramps down for curbs so that people can go to the different booths and all that. There's those certain scenarios that don't necessarily get considered when we think of inclusion and when we think of accessibility. So we want to be a part of society just like everybody else. And by having this scenario go on, it allows us to be involved. And I'm going to get out of my office and have fun with all my friends and enjoy the space instead of being stuck at home and thinking, oh, it would have been great to go to this festival, or it would have been great to go to this concert in the building. But instead it's so much effort. So when we build new buildings and we build festivals, we need to think of everybody that would attend and hopefully enjoy themselves, because we want to go in and we want to be able to tell all our friends, hey, yeah, I've got a disability, but you know what? I had a great time, and the building made it easier, or the festival event people made it fun so that I could actually enjoy myself and take a break from the everyday life that we have as a person with a disability.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Jama and I'm an organizer with the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, and I'm here to talk to you about the broader context around disability justice. To me, the disability justice means that we need to move away from the capitalist focus of understandings around access. That means that disabled people want more than just access to stores and ramps to stores so that we can buy things and expand our economic purchasing power. The truth is, many people with disabilities can't work and shouldn't have to in order to be seen as valuable. Our ability to produce shouldn't dictate our ability to survive, but the confines of our current system have been built to discard anyone who can't produce. So take, for example, Huronia, the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots, and how people with disabilities were forcibly institutionalized, and the Alberta Sterilization Act, where people with disabilities and Indigenous women were forcibly sterilized without their will, their knowledge, or their consent. We see these forms of structural violence in our present day as well. So their funding for prenatal screening of Down syndrome has more investment nationally than the funding for adults with Down syndrome, for example. And I'm pro-choice, but the decisions in terms of systemic erasure of entire populations financially is a form of modern day eugenics. Take, for example, police violence, the killings of DeAndre Campbell, Abdirahman Abdi, and Solomon Fakiri, as well as Andrew Loku, all people with disabilities who are Black or racialized, who were killed when they should have been given proper mental health supports, who were killed while waiting for proper mental health supports in this country. Take, for example, the Canadian emergency response benefits and the ways the government said out of one side of their mouths that people are worth $2,000 a month at least, and yet people with disabilities are still legislated into poverty, still making a little bit of under $1,000 a month, not able to pay for food and rent at the same time, legislated into being poor. Take, for example, almost like about how almost all the deaths in terms of COVID in Canada have been disabled people in long-term care homes. And how in a lot of these long-term care homes, people with disabilities are often being abused. Take, for example, medical assistance in dying legislation that's coming out in December, where there was a removal of the foreseeable death portion. This idea that people with disabilities can now apply to die with a doctor helping them out, even if they're not on the way to dying, right? And so our government is prioritizing this idea that disabled people who are not able to produce should be locked away in a long-term care home or be able to access death, right? Instead of allowing the financial supports to be able to support disabled people in living free and equal lives in this country. It's to the benefit of those empowered to ignore these connections and to discuss and to not discuss disposability culture that's mandated in our policies. When writing about disability and focusing on disability, as writers and authors, and all of you listening today, it's important to remember that our existence is inherently political. We, by existing, point out the deep flaws in the current systems that are structured around disposability, and we are not side characters to your plots and your narratives and your stories. We're here despite systems that keep telling us that we shouldn't be. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gift Tshuma. I'm an artist from Blurring the Boundaries, based in here in Montreal. And today I'd like to talk to you about creating access through music. And how do we do that practically, you may be wondering. Well, I think it's important to look at the following questions, like, are we identifying or creating space to create access within the music scene, whether it's in the design of instruments or the music technology being used. And also another question that is very important is, what are disabled artists already doing out there with the material that they have? This actually makes me think of a disabled artist based in the UK. His name is John Kelly. He actually designed an electric guitar called the Telecaster, and he designed it in a way that was actually accessible to him, where he's able to strum the guitar with his right hand, and to change the chords, he uses the keyboard to do that, and he did that with his team. So Blurring the Boundaries, which is a collective of artists based in the UK and Canada, tries to blur the boundaries when it comes to design phase of musical instruments and music technology. And our collective is actually based on the famous slogan, "Nothing about us without us." Nothing about us without us. It is really important that those who have a disability are involved within the design phase. They're actually the innovators. And it is really important that we dismantle the hierarchy that often exists between so-called experts and the subject or the artists involved. And we do this through an improvisation process, or when we do musical technology and design. And some of the important variables that are dear to us is that the tools that are being used to make an instrument accessible have to be cost efficient and open source, or at least free. we all like free stuff, right? So if resources are open source, then people have the option to actually customize the tools and the resources to their own needs. And just to bring it back again, in terms of the goals, we want to identify the barriers, we want to identify the strengths, and to identify the resources. Once we've done that, then we're able to create a community. And last year in the fall, we were able to create a great community of artists in the UK. And we were able to have R&D sessions, research and development sessions, where we created instruments and software, and there was no hierarchy between experts and innovators. Everyone was in the equal playing field. And to do that successfully, it requires a certain level of openness. And what do I mean by that? We like to take a jazz approach, meaning improvisation. And when we're designing something, we do not have an expectation on the end result, but we want people to have an open mind to explore different things, because you're actually able to reach results that you may not have thought of before. And that's what we base our workshops on, and is actually an open contract into getting an end result for that. And honestly, when it comes to music, it is about community building. It is about connecting with people and expression. And that's what we try to do. If that's something that interests you, get in touch with us at blurringboundaries.org. And you can also check out our social media as well, Blurring Boundaries. And we'd love to connect and make some music with you.
Hello, my name is Dorothy Ellen Palmer. I'm a retired high school teacher, improv coach, union branch president, and now a disabled senior writer. Unfortunately, today is a really bad pain day for me, so I'm going to be reading the rest of my talk to you. What kind of inclusion in the arts can I possibly expect when I haven't left my apartment in 7 months, since March 8th? While I stay home in an attempt to save my life and the life of others, I can and do expect equal virtual access. Ironically, virtual access can improve inclusion for disabled people and seniors like me. But please let me first explain a little bit about my work as a disability activist in CanLit. Before the pandemic, only 3% of literary events in Canada were wheelchair accessible. Most were held in funky downtown buildings with steps at the door and a washroom in the basement, inaccessible to me and my walker. As I've researched and written, Toronto has 0 wheelchair accessible independent bookstores. The entire country of Canada has 0 wheelchair accessible writing retreats. Governments and arts councils happily violate their own funding guidelines and the Charter of Rights which forbid discrimination by ability. Of course, ableism is systemic, but its exclusion is practiced and perpetuated by the daily choices of individuals. When I asked my CanLit colleagues to please not organize, perform at, or attend any inaccessible events, some agreed. We're building bridges and doing great work together. But most offered me the equivalent of thoughts and prayers. I got told that my inclusion was too expensive, too time-consuming, too fringe, not urgent, not possible this year, not possible at all, but maybe next year, dear, if you do the unpaid labor to find us a new venue. This reply came from politically aware colleagues who would be horrified at excluding any other marginalized group. But keeping my communities out? Oh well, too bad, so sad. Ableism and ageism are the only hatreds that come with an apology and a shrug. Accordingly, it is bittersweet for the disabled community during this pandemic to see all the virtual access to jobs, education, and the arts that we have been demanding as our human rights for decades become widely and instantly available because abled people needed them. It has also been exciting, energizing, and uplifting to explore the possibilities of virtual access with the disabled community. I was delighted, for example, to be a keynote speaker for 50 young disabled storytellers. That virtual event, with both ASL and captioning, made it possible for young artists right across the country to both participate in and attend who would have not been able to do either in person. We've all heard the phrase, we can't go back to normal because normal wasn't working. I'm so glad abled people have finally discovered this. But just as Columbus did not discover America, abled people did not discover inaccessibility or its solutions. Disabled seniors and disabled people have been here all along. It is, however, the same colonial capitalism that wants us to think that only the voices of abled people matter, that whining about Zoom fatigue is more important than facing the fact that Zoom gives temporarily inconvenienced abled people far more inclusion than they ever gave me. This uncomfortable truth has real-life consequences. The exclusion of seniors and disabled people, especially the exclusion of racialized seniors and disabled people, fuels eugenics. It accepts disabled and senior erasure. It normalizes the vile idea that disabled people and seniors who do not produce wealth for capitalism are disposable and expendable, that we are what the Nazis called life unworthy of life. This is the very eugenics that writes pandemic hospital protocols deciding who will die. After the pandemic, will disabled artists rush right back to using inaccessible buildings and formats and pretend they're doing nothing wrong? Probably. But if we want to change that, we must start including disabled people and seniors now. We must demand a representation that reflects our numbers as 23% of the population. This means that 1 in 4 participants at every event should be disabled. One should also be a senior. It means grappling with this. Despite what their other important intersections and identities might be, no group of abled people under 50 is truly ever diverse. Young abled diversity is not true diversity. It's just better looking exclusion. Whose job is inclusion? It's my job, it's your job, it's everyone's job. True inclusion can only be reached when we all agree consistently to act on the first principle of disability justice. All bodies are good bodies, and there must be no body and nobody left behind.
Thank you so much, Darby, Sarah, Gift, and Dorothy, wrapping up our talks with a mic drop there. I also want to say hello to our audience members. We have people registered from all over: Saskatoon, Ottawa, Nanaimo, Calgary, and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have closed captioning. There is a link in chat. Thank you to our closed captioner who is doing this live. It's now time for the Q&A. And if you'd like to submit a question, just jump into chat, and we're going to do our best to get to as many audience questions as possible. Our moderator tonight is from the Walrus family. It's TD Fellow on Disability Inclusion, Aimee Louw. Aimee, I'm going to hand it over to you. Looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with everyone. And before we jump into the conversation, I just want to thank everyone for their generous offerings tonight, and I can't wait to dive in even more. My first question is for you, Gift, and as some of you may know, we go way back, but one question that I've never actually had a chance to ask you, Gift, is how did you come about planning and co-creating Blurring the Boundaries? Like, how did it come about?
Actually, so one of my business partners, Charles Matthews, he saw me at an event and we're having a conversation and talking about starting something in the UK. He told me about the project he was working on, and I was like, you know what, it would be nice for us to start something in Montreal similar to that. And at that moment, it was simply just a conversation. And a few months later, we started working remotely. He was based in the UK at the time. And then we got on board another artist, David Barbier, on the team. And Blurring the Boundaries was born under the New Conversations project as part of British Council program.
Okay, well, I love how creative it sounds, and like, I love the idea of design being like jazz. That's just so neat. So I'd love to hear more about that as the conversation goes on.
For sure.
And Sarah, like something along those lines, you mentioned sort of the role that writers and media and people who do creative work have in disability justice. And I'd love to hear what you think about that relationship. Like, what role do media producers, writers have in disability justice, and also vice versa?
I really resonate a lot with what Dorothy was saying, right? We can't just talk the talk, but we need to walk the walk in terms of making sure like our creativities are accessible. And I think that oftentimes in the art world, disabled people are made to be tropes, whether we're supervillains, whether we're side characters that are meant to be saved. So really, if you value this idea of creation and this idea of, you know, telling stories that aren't told, make sure that you're reaching out to actual disabled people in your everyday life and not you know, additions to your plot in order to help things sell or to fit, right? Disabled people are complicated. No two of us are the same. And so make sure that when you're talking about inclusion from a disability justice framework, that you're not just talking about individual personalized vulnerability stories, you're talking about systemic structures and the ways that we're left out.
Well, that's a really interesting point that you bring up, the actual content of, you know, stories and the sort of history of disabled people serving stories, but not necessarily being featured. And on that note, Dorothy, what's it been like launching your book, Falling for Myself, at this specific time and in, as you mentioned, a very inaccessible literature environment or industry? What's it been like? Dorothy, you're muted. Do you mind to unmute yourself? Thank you. We'll,
there we go. There we go. Sorry. Yeah, my book launched in November, and my publisher, Woolsack & Wynne, was right on board at finding accessible venues, including for the launch. So I was lucky enough to do a number of in-person events. I physically, in solidarity with any of my disabled friends, will not go to any inaccessible event, even though physically I could probably drag my walker up a stair or two, but I won't do it because there would be other people who would be left behind. And that has made me a bit of a oddity in CanLit. There are a handful of us whose solidarity goes that far. There are a lot of people who make exceptions. And I think they make exceptions, if I could draw on something that Sarah was saying, because of the way capitalism molds our minds, makes us think that it is a charity that people are giving disabled people, granting us something wonderful, and then they don't ever have to do it again. So this notion that it isn't our human right, it's something that abled people get to be gatekeepers and decide whether or not our access is good enough. That charity model that keeps a lot of CanLit back, keeps their ideas and their attitudes stuck in a place, which doesn't make it shameful to them to go to an inaccessible event. Whereas it would be shameful to go to an event that only included white people and wouldn't let people of color in. It would be shameful to go to an event that only included men and wouldn't let women in. But it isn't shameful to go to an event that only includes abled people and won't let disabled people in. So we need to rethink that.
Yeah, and touching on something that you mentioned about the ongoing nature of accessibility and needing to kind of reassess as we go, I'd love to hear from you, Darby. In your consulting work, are you normally brought in at a certain point of a project, like at the beginning or after completion of a certain design project? And what works best in your opinion, like as a consultant?
Well, I think for us, like including accessibility right from the get-go is the most effective way for all of us to make sure that we're included. Does it happen? Not a chance. There's definitely projects where we've seen them in schematic or concept design, but is the thought really there? Not necessarily. Where we've come in at design development, yeah, that's better than waiting till construction documents or even waiting till it's starting to be built. And then it's like, oh, this doesn't make sense. We should involve somebody. So it totally sort of varies. Now we're seeing it more and more to the forefront where we're actually being part of RFPs, where the architects and the prime design teams actually have to consider it right from the get-go. That's great. But years ago, and even still today, we're struggling to get people to see accessibility as being a key component, especially when they build new buildings or go to renovate. It's always an afterthought, and it's one of the first things to be cut from budgets as well when they have to do budgets again.
It's such a tricky thing, right? Because you want a certain outcome. Like I imagine in your work, Darby, you want a certain base level of accessibility, right? And similarly to Dorothy, like from what I've seen of your work, you know, basic things like let's have a wheelchair accessible venue, let's have captioning, etc. But I want to hear a bit from Gift about the design project that you mentioned where you don't have the final product in mind when you're designing, and what's that like from an accessibility and design point of view?
So we take the approach of like the aesthetics of access, which means that we are not trying to bolt in accessibility into something. You're trying to embed it as a flowing process. So what I mean by that is that we look at what you already have and what can we do with what we have in terms of the material you have, the resources you have with regards to technology, and what can we do to make something creative and beautiful in terms of performance or musical expression. And sometimes when we do that, we're actually able to go further than what we had initially thought of within the first phase of like the design, for example. I don't know if that—
Do you think that comes from sort of what Sarah and Dorothy have been outlining with, especially with their talks, where we operate within certain ways of being that sort of limit even what we think is possible? Like, is that sort of are you working against that in your music work? Or?
Yeah, most certainly. Like as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, for example, when I create music, I use 2 different softwares to compose music. And those softwares are not initially intended to communicate with each other. Basically, I'm trying to repurpose its initial purpose for creating music to work for me. And unfortunately, within musical instruments or musical technology, accessibility is not always at the forefront within their innovative process.
Yeah, for sure. And something that came up in part 1 of our discussion on Tuesday was specifically in relation to workplaces, but I think it applies to all the different fields that you all have spoken about today, which is sort of the question of, in the pandemic, when companies and organizations are already struggling financially, what would everyone say? Like, I just invite anyone to jump in here. What would you say to a small business, for example, or an arts or media organization who's saying, now's not the time because we don't have the extra budget to implement like certain accessibility features? I would invite anyone to jump in.
I would ask, when is the time then? If now is not the time, that there's never a good time actually, right? I'd say like every opportunity is the time to address things and to move forward. The longer we wait, the further we are to our target point. to our goal. So like every opportunity, whether the climate that we're in is not optimal, it is actually an opportunity to push our objectives forward.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, we're switching gears mildly, but it is related. We have a question here from one of our audience members named Stacy. And Stacy asked, what are your thoughts on basic income guarantee and its potential effect for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I definitely think Stacy's question ties back to the previous question too, around accountability. Whose role is it to make sure that our environments are accessible, and who's at fault here for the ways in which disabled people are being let down? I have a friend, Siobhan, who always says, if you're going to talk about access, then you should budget for it. Like, you can't talk about accessibility without budgeting for it. So if you're applying for grants on a micro individual level, always leave a line for accessibility. That's an easy thing to do. If you can't do that, then don't apply for your grant. You don't deserve it.
Sarah, I want to just ask a follow-up. Do you have, just for people out there, who are like, oh, that's a great idea, what percentage of the budget would you suggest as attributing like an accessibility line to in a grant application?
I don't think it's a fixed mechanical thing. I think it's a practice of like adapting to what it is you're trying to do, what are you trying to accomplish, and how much is it going to take to get there based off of the grant you're applying for, right? I think there are mathematics that you have to work out, but if you're not willing to do the basic work of like leaving a budget line, even in your grant application, then you shouldn't apply. But tying that back to the question about basic income, like how do you take that mindset of personal accountability in your work and take that into a macro level? When you look at the government, they're failing to do the exact same thing. They said out of their mouth that people deserved a minimum of $2,000 a month to survive this pandemic. And while allowing in almost every single other province, disabled people to be legislated into poverty, to not have enough money to live, to pay rent and afford food at the same time, right? And so how are they accounting for the fact that there are people in this country who cannot work and still have the right to live? The decisions that they are making are saying like, no, actually, we don't think disabled people get to live, because they're allowing people to starve and die and be homeless. The solution to that, one of the solutions, is a guaranteed basic livable income, which Leah Gazan put forward with the NDP in Parliament as a petition. But UBI is important. This idea of a basic income is very important, so long as it does not gut other services available. And so conservatives are using this language, and have from the beginning of this conversation around a universal basic income, to say, okay, give these people who are complaining one lump sum and gut every other service. We know that our healthcare is still imperfect. We know that we don't have proper universal pharmacare, mental health supports, and all these other things that disabled people also need to survive. So yes, Stacey, to answer your question, 100% I'm down for a universal basic income, so long as our other services are not gutted along with it. We need both these things, because unless the government can account for it, then they're not being truthful.
I see Dorothy nodding. Do you want to add to that, Dorothy?
I couldn't add to that. That's a perfect answer.
Okay, fabulous. Well said. Oh my. So something that Darby, you mentioned, the sort of like risk mitigation in your work, and the sort of like designing for avoiding danger, specifically in like arts fields. And I'd love to hear more about that side of your work.
Well, I think like I said earlier, if you think about accessibility and you think about it as a space, not only as a person with a disability can they get hurt, but can an able-bodied individual get hurt? And what sort of scenarios are taken into consideration? Like, for example, at one of our music festivals where we've got accessible seating, it's up on a platform. Yeah, makes total sense. But below them is standing room, and it's late at night, the stage lights go down, and then everybody tries to leave park at the same time. Well, now you've got the able-bodied individuals that were in standing room that have had some alcohol, or haven't, but I'm sure they have. And then you've got persons with disabilities trying to use that same path, which then they collide. And if I'm on my scooter, I'm at a lower height than somebody who's walking, so therefore they don't see us. So it's trying to mitigate and think about the safety features of how do we have everybody exit that park the same way? How do we, in a sporting facility, if something was to go wrong and we needed to evacuate that facility, how are we going to get everybody out? But how are we also going to get persons with disabilities out safely and not get anybody injured or trampled like we've seen in the nightclub scenarios down in the States? We forget about, we get everybody into the buildings and into the festivals, but we forget when something goes wrong, how do we get everybody out safely?
That's a really good point. Thanks, Darby. And something that is coming up for me in my mind is sort of the question of representation and having people at different stages of the sort of decision-making process and that sort of thing. And Dorothy, you mentioned the ratio, like one disabled person out of a group of 4 people, sort of general public, in order for an event to be representative. And in your opinion, how do we go about this? And like, how do organizations or venues or, you know, cultural spaces in specific do their due diligence and get that one out of 4 representation at different levels of those processes?
Yeah, I talk about numbers because colonial capitalism has done such an excellent job at erasing the presence of disabled people everywhere that most people think disabled people are 5 or 6 or 7% of the population. So when the census says it's 23% or more, and more in many marginalized groups, we need to think of 1 in 4, and that's just a ballpark. And if there is a one of an entire festival, and always the same person and always a young white woman who can walk, then we have a problem, because that is absolute tokenism. It makes a festival think, a literary festival think, well, check that box, we've got 1 disabled people. Yes, we have 100 participants, but we have 1 disabled person, that's enough. So we need to talk a little bit about numbers. And it gets back to Sarah's point about accountability. I will appear in a panel if there is a fair representation of marginalized groups. I always ask. I ask other writers to ask. I would never appear in an all-white panel, period. I think people should be asking about that.
Do you think it's on like panelists themselves to do that research?
It starts there, yes. When you're accepting a gig, you ask who else is going to be on the panel. I also think before you attend, you find out who else is on the panel. You also check if a building is accessible or inaccessible. And I hold both panelists and attendees responsible for that. Every day in your workplace, in your entertainment places, you walk into inaccessible bars and barbershops and everywhere else that's inaccessible. But I come from a union background, and I should be able to work in my chosen field of CanLit. So if the building itself is not inaccessible, that's everybody's job.
Gift and Sarah, do you have anything to add to that? Because I do see you nodding, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I completely agree with Dorothy. I mean, like, disability justice and this like conversation that we're having now, it's not a sector, it's a mindset, right? And so like, how are we as people on this call going to do the mental gymnastics and the work, like the real work of trying to understand how to make our work more accessible to the people that we claim to want to include, right? There's no math to it. There's no calculation that you can do. It's going to take real intentional, heartfelt work in terms of thinking about how to recreate the spaces that you're in to fit everybody.
Yeah, I think Dorothy and Sarah have said this so beautifully. But what I would add and what I try to look at, the way I look at disability justice is that it has to become a lifestyle. And that's something that I try to do in every aspect of my life, whether I'm in my work environment where there may be lots of red tape and lots of barriers for folks, or whether I'm at home, I try to at least infuse disability justice in the conversation in one way or another.
I've heard the words, like the phrase disability justice a lot, and you've all shared different aspects of it tonight, which is really rich and enriching. And with the last few minutes that we do have together, I'd love to just go through and hear sort of what disability justice means to you, or what disability rights means to you. And we'll just sort of close our conversation with that. So I'll just start with Dorothy, just because she's first on my screen, and then we'll go from there.
I think I'm going to repeat Sarah's word. It's a mindset, and then it's a mindset put into practice. And it rejects any kind of ranking of bodies by colonial capitalism, which wants us to only see bodies of value who can produce or labor or consume under capitalism. And if people can't do that, we should be shunted off into long-term care homes or not given the kinds of resources that we need to live. So it's about nothing about us without us. It's about everybody is a good body. It's about the most marginalized and the most oppressed should lead. And it's about nobody and nobody left behind. Everyone is included.
Thank you, Dorothy. And Gift, you're up next.
Why? It's hard to
no pressure, no pressure.
Dorothy said it so beautifully. Nothing about us without us. As I mentioned, our Blurring the Boundaries collective is based on that premise. Nothing about us without us. And I think accessibility shouldn't be perceived, or disability justice rather, shouldn't be perceived as like a place to reach or an ending point, but should be seen as like a continuous, ever changing endpoint, which requires flexibility, which comes back to like my artistic side of like looking at accessibility or adaptation from a jazz framework, from a jazz perspective, where like you are adapting, you're improvising, you are not boxing yourself within a certain lens or framework of what accessibility should look like. It's an ever evolving thing that requires you to tango and requires you to play the jazz.
See, that to me, it makes it sound fun, honestly, rather than it being a requirement or regulations. And not to say that regulations shouldn't be a part of the conversation, but just thinking of it in a sort of playful way is really appealing. That's really neat. Yeah, I'd love to invite you, Darby, to share your thoughts on disability justice and disability rights.
Well, I think everybody on the panel has made it very clear, and they're all brilliant statements. There's not a whole lot more to add to that, other than the fact that we need to start continuing, or not start, but continuing this conversation about accessibility, inclusion, and making sure that everybody feels warm and welcome, and not seeing, you know, when they think of accessibility or anything like that, they see dollar signs. They see how we're going to cost people money, whether it's in the workplace or events, like whatever it is, they see dollar signs. And it's trying to change that mentality that just because I have a disability doesn't mean I actually sit at home and watch Netflix. You know, I want to be a part of society, and I want to be out in the community and be involved as much as I can, because it's my community that makes me who I am. So we need to continue the conversation that we've had here, and everything that everybody said tonight is totally on point. There's, you know, they're continually great conversation starters, and it's the mindset. It's trying to get people to see past it and see people for people and not for disabilities.
I've really enjoyed the variety of perspectives and also experiences in this conversation so much. And yeah, Sarah, I'd love to hear your closing thoughts for tonight.
Yeah, I agree with everybody. And to me, disability justice is a blueprint to revolution. right? Because if we can reframe and rebuild our environments, or whether it's our immediate environments or the systems around us that are harming everyday people because certain people can't produce and give back to the economy in ways that are seen as useful. If we can reframe that and rebuild something where everybody is able to exist, no matter what their body is like, no matter what their ability to give back to the environment or community or systems are like, where everybody has worth no matter if they're disabled or not, then we're one step closer to like undoing the harm that is all around us. I definitely would also advise everybody who's interested in learning about disability justice to look up Sins Invalid. They're a queer racialized artist collective based out of San Francisco, and they actually coined the term disability justice so that we could move away from just talking about bare bones of access and inclusion. So I would look them up.
Thanks for that suggestion. Yeah, for sure. And I think they have a show going on right now, if it's not already passed. So they do really neat performance work and stuff. So I think that's a great suggestion. Listen, I want to thank everybody for writing in the questions and comments too. And I just saw a comment from someone with a really long number as their name. So I won't repeat their name, but they wrote #inclusion revolution, which I think is pretty fun as a comment to kind of close this out. So I just want to thank everybody. And as you know, this was the second event in a two-part series, but I hope that we can continue this conversation in different ways. And I want to thank everybody behind the scenes too, who have been helping like organize this event and doing everything in the technical side and that sort of thing. So that's our time for the Q&A, but I want to just say thank you again, and I'll hand it back to Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And as Lisa said in this comment, thank you all for flipping the script. So thank you so much, Darby Lee Young, Sarah Jama, Gift Tshuma, Dorothy Ellen Palmer, and the Walrus TD Fellow on Disability and Inclusion, our moderator this evening, Aimee Louw. If you enjoyed tonight's event, there's more. We have the Walrus Talks at Home coming up on Monday, November 16th. The Walrus Talks Living Better, that's with Concordia University. Then on Thursday, November 19th, it's the Walrus Talks at Home at the Broadbent Institute's 2020 Progress Gala. And then on Thursday, November 26th, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation presents the Walrus Talks at Home Housing. If you go to our website, thewalrus.ca/events, the schedule is there. You can RSVP. There's also videos from previous talks. And we're going to be sending you an email. So keep an eye on your inbox, because the best way to stay in touch with the Walrus and to make sure you don't miss any of our events is by signing up for our newsletter. The Walrus is a registered nonprofit, and we're really proud of the journalism, the events, and podcasts that we do. And this is thanks to the support of our community of donors and sponsors. So if you enjoyed this free event tonight, please donate. The address is thewalrus.ca/donate. And what's really cool is if you make a gift by the end of this year, it will be matched dollar for dollar up to $100,000. Thanks to the generosity of Diane Blake and Stephen Smith, who are matching donations with a donation of their own. They believe that a healthy society is an informed one, and we're so happy to have their support. A few more thank yous. Thank you to Andrea Barrick, Naki Osute, and everyone at TD Bank Group. This includes Farah Kurji and Tomas Shanzi for making tonight's conversation possible. We'd also like to thank our annual sponsors, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Air Canada, and Shaw. And in these COVID times, which I think have lasted much longer than we all thought back in March, community is really important, and each one of you is part of the Walrus. Now, to close things out, we're going to play some of Gift Tshuma's music. Wait for it. And thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great evening.